Welcome to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Today is Friday, January 17th, day 469 of the war. Amanda Borschel-Dan here at our Jerusalem offices, joined by U.S. Bureau Chief Jacob Magid from Chicago for the Friday Focus. Thanks for joining me, Jacob.
Hi, Amanda. Good to be with you.
Such a pleasure. And listeners, as you know, diplomatic reporter Lazer Berman and I started this Friday Focus series recently to delve it deeply and give historical background to issues in the news today. And Lazer is on reserve duty in the IDF for the next several weeks, but he's here in spirit as I occupy his office. And those watching on YouTube will see Lazer's prized map of Scotland right behind me in the background. So he's definitely still with us. Jacob, thank you so much for taking up the gauntlet to do this Friday Focus with me.
You could say this is my reserve duty.
Great. You're reserve of the reserve. So, Jacob, as U.S. President Joe Biden's term comes to an end, I want to speak with you about his legacy vis-a-vis Israel. And, this week it's come to a real end cap with the hostage release deal that is still, as we're recording, a little bit up in the air. But let's begin with his Zionist street cred, which he has talked about so many different times before. And of course, there's the famous Golda Meir story. So do you want to tell us the famous Golda Meir story? But you have to do it in Joe Biden's accent. Can you?
Well, folks. Okay, I'll stop there. Yeah, that's a story I was actually kind of surprised, if you think about it, now that you mention it, that it wasn't mentioned in President Biden's speech yesterday when he announced the ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas, because at least the first few years of his term, so I guess there you really just constantly, every speech had that story where he talks about how he was a young senator visiting Israel for the first time, and he met with Golda Meir, and he remembers a young general there who he called Rabin, and he recalls fondly how he had this warm moment with Golda where he admits, after Golda shows him all the threats that Israel's facing, he admits that he's quite concerned, and Golda Meir picks up on this just by his facial expressions. And she says, "What's wrong?" And he explains. And Golda Meir says, we have one secret weapon, I guess you could say the Israelis do. We have no other place to go. And then Biden often says this line twice: we have no other place to go. And I think that's a story that clearly is stuck with Biden. It's a good speech to give in front of crowds of pro-Israel supporters, which he has been able to maintain, despite some, I guess you could say, rough patches with Prime Minister Netanyahu over the years, 44 years to be exact. But I think that line about you don't have to be a Jew to be a Zionist is something that he said early on during his term, also before he entered office. But what was more remarkable is that he kept saying it even as that term got more and more politicized, more and more unpopular, as Israel's war in Gaza became a lot harder for the U.S. to justify, at least the way it was supporting it, in terms of the more progressive public or the international uproar. But Biden didn't seem to be fazed by that. And even as he left office, even as I think in some of the most difficult times in terms of the U.S.'s relationship, he continued to insist that there was no issue with being a Zionist, even if you're not a Jew.
And I would say you can be a Zionist if you're not a Jew, and you can be a Zionist even if you're not supportive of what the Israeli government happens to be doing. And we saw that, of course, throughout Biden's career, too. I'm thinking specifically of the Obama years. And so I think that these years colored the relationship going into Biden's term as president. Would you agree with me on that?
Somewhat. I do think, yes, Biden is very much a part of that of that first Obama administration, but I think he was also seen as somewhat of the responsible adult in the room at times. Or at least someone who was less critical of Israel publicly than Obama was seen to be. If you remember, there was that big incident around the settlement announcement in Ramat Shlomo in East Jerusalem, right when President Biden was about to arrive, and there was a lot of uproar in the Obama administration. It was actually President Biden or Vice President Biden at the time, that quietly was able to ease tensions between the sides and get the Obama administration and Netanyahu government past that. And also, towards the end of Obama's term, it was actually Biden who privately cautioned against the U.S. allowing a UN Security Council resolution against Israeli settlements. It was actually Biden who said that wasn't the right move. Ultimately, he didn't win out that argument. But I think he was a more, I guess you could say, pro-Israeli government at that time, even voice in the administration. And I think that carried with him the next time he came into office, where he really believed in this arm around Israel approach, which was basically the concept of, yes, we might not agree with what Israel's doing, but it's better to try, at least initially, to carry out our disagreements behind closed doors. And even just through basically a Socratic method of dealing with Netanyahu, where you constantly pose questions that are trying to poke holes into what they feel is his war strategy, at least in the 2021 war. And through that process, maybe getting him arm around Israel to maybe move a little bit closer to what the U.S. would like to see. And I think you could say that worked in the 2021 Gaza war, which is one of the first issues that Biden had to deal with upon entering office, only 6 months in, that it was able to be ended after just 11 days. And the point that the Biden administration took from that is the strategy we're going to try to use going forward. And there are a lot of reasons why it didn't work in the years that followed. There was a different government, but I think that's the mindset that Biden tried to use as he entered office.
Really interesting to think of it as the Socratic method. And I hear what you're saying there. I just wonder how he was received here in Israel at the same time, because that sounds kind of patronizing in a way.
I think at the beginning of the war, I think they wanted that more fatherly figure, Israelis did, and he was very much appreciated for the way he came to Israel, the speeches he gave in the immediate aftermath after October 7th. And then, of course, that I think I spoke with one official who said that President Biden, after hearing Netanyahu's voice during the first call that they held on October 7th, made the decision right away that he had to come to Israel because he was really concerned about how hard, obviously, and understandably so, Netanyahu was taking it, but also recognizing that the people needed someone that could to play that figure, especially given the stage that Biden's at in his career. I think that wasn't something that was taken as in a patronizing way, and also given, for example, even before the war, with the judicial overhaul that the Prime Minister's and Netanyahu's government was trying to advance, that was something that it seemed to be a near majority of the public was against, or a slight majority. And I think they appreciated the steps Biden took, that he didn't try to say, don't do a specific pieces of legislation, but he talked about framing things as the importance of moving forward with a consensus. And I think he did play a role. When you talk about later on, his influence really waned. But I think in the judicial overhaul, I think he did play a role in maybe rolling back some of the steps that Israel is taking. And I think it was because of that approach that, yes, maybe some would call it patronizing, but he did it in a way, at least to a lot of people, I think, in Israel, they didn't feel like it was overstepping.
There was a lot going on, of course, during all the years leading up to the war and the war on. But one of the things that stood out to me in terms of the Biden administration, I don't know about Biden himself, is the relationship with the finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, and the national security minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir. And in terms of relationship, I guess I mean no relationship.
Yeah, there was a decision made to basically hold a de facto boycott of these two far-right ministers. Basically, the argument was that if we meet with them, we're legitimizing their views. And that belief, I think, held true for the first, I guess you could say, so the second and third years of the Biden administration. The first year you had like this lame duck period of Netanyahu, and then you had a Bennett-Lapid government, if people have probably forgotten that at this point. But then when Netanyahu won the election, and this government was put together, that was the decision pretty made early on. There wasn't like a formal announcement, we're not going to be meeting with them, but that was clearly the decision that was made. And as time went on, I think there were some in the Biden administration that started to question the effectiveness of that decision. I spoke with one source close to Smotrich who said basically it allowed the finance minister specifically to just continue doing whatever he wanted because he wasn't beholden to a Biden administration. When you have a relationship with another minister, it's a give and take. And that relationship requires, I think it would have required Smotrich to maybe make some of the decisions that he might not have wanted to make. regarding maybe releasing funds for the Palestinians or limiting the construction of outposts in the West Bank that we saw massively expand to, I think it was about 60 over the past, since the war started, unprecedented numbers. So the influence that the Biden administration had really waned because of this lack of engagement, was what some in the administration felt. Others, I think, still maintained that it was also politically fraught to, at least even domestically, to maybe start engaging with these kinds of really controversial figures. It would have led to blowback from progressives in the party who were pushing to even sanction them, a decision that Biden did not ultimately take, but it was one that he did consider. And I think there was a decision at the White House level to, again, maintain that boycott. But it was interesting to know, sources I spoke with, that both Tom Nides and Jack Lew, the people who are the ambassadors to Israel, who are actually the ones that are going to be tasked with trying to manage the relationship on the ground, they felt that this decision to not engage with them was a mistake and a missed opportunity to at least try to sway Smotrich anyway. Ben-Gvir was another story. I think they were never going to, and there was a little bit less of a reason. He still did have a role in the rampant settler violence that was taking place over the past few years, and basically telling the police not to look into it, and police who wanted to advance in their roles knew not to try to prosecute those crimes. And he was just seen as a more controversial figure than Smotrich. But I think there was a recognition by some of these folks in the administration that maybe if we were to do this again, we would do things a little bit differently. Last thing I'll just say is that, on the other hand, just keep playing double sides here, that we were able to get at the very end of the administration a major agreement from Smotrich to extend the banking corresponding deal, which allows Israeli and Palestinian banks to correspond, to basically do deals with one another, which is a key part of the Palestinian economy. They extended that for 1 whole year. And that is a massive decision that was taken maybe because of pressure from the incoming Trump administration, who knows? But I think despite the lack of engagement with Smotrich, he was able to get that major win for the Biden administration to keep the Palestinian Authority from collapsing.
A lot of this was supercharged by the origins of Christianity, because Judaism and Christianity had this family fight because all the early Christians were Jews, but unfortunately it got put in a sacred book, so it stays forever. Anti-Semitism is unique in that Jews are both subhuman and superhuman. They're like vermin who run the world. If you look at the Nazi stuff, that's exactly what it says. The English scholar Hyman Maccabi had this theory that the reason that that's so is you can't kill a god unless you're super evil. And so there is this trope, I think, planted in the Western mind that then got transferred to the Muslim world that really almost required an exorcism, that behind every evil, ultimately, there is this super evil genius, and that's identified with the Jew. And I know this sounds crazy, but again and again and again, you see this. Doesn't matter what it is that happens that is bad in the world, someone somewhere will assume that the Jews were behind it.
We have mentioned so many times about this idea of the sanctions on the settler extremists. And of course, we've talked about several times as well that Smotrich and Ben-Gvir were named alongside the major settler organization Amanah, which of course I believe was sanctioned in the end. And it is such a push-pull situation when you have an administration in the U.S. that is not, maybe patronizing isn't the right word, but definitely trying to educate the Israelis into doing more, to educate the Israelis into proper behavior, shall we say, which is interesting. And I wonder, you as U.S. Bureau Chief, are you seeing the U.S. Behaving in this way to other allied countries?
I think the relationship with Israel has always been very unique. And I don't think you have this kind of very strange, sometimes patronizing dynamic that you see take place between these two allies. But I also think there's some that would say that this is because there's just so much focus in the press and in the public as well. I think there's a lot of public interest in the story. I think there's a reason why it goes to the top of the front page of New York Times and other major news sites every day, because there is public interest. I think there's a combination of, it's also the press's choice to feed into that. But because of that just obsession, I think you see from so many, I think that there is this decision to really treat it differently. And just the fact that every single statement on this issue is gone through countless numbers of rewrites and has to be checked by all sorts of people before it goes out. Whereas if it's a statement that the State Department wanted to make on Algeria, for example, the State Department can make that decision without really even consulting very many people in the White House. But with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, everything goes through the White House and everything is checked to make sure that we're saying the exact right things. I think for good and for bad, I think the other reason why some in the White House say that this needs to be done is because we do have, yes, a special relationship, but we're also giving massive amounts of security assistance to Israel that therefore warrants us an ability and a right to maybe have more of a say in some of the decisions that Israel's making.
Okay, so let's talk about the special relationship a little bit more, and specifically the weapons packages. And under Obama, I think it was the largest package. And then again, now under Biden, we've reached new astronomical numbers. Is that correct, Jacob?
So the 10-year memorandum of understanding that Obama signed with Netanyahu at the end of Obama's term is still in place. But yes, we've had these massive packages because of the war to supplement that, billions of dollars of new weaponry and restocking of different interceptor missiles, like for the Iron Dome, for example.
And this was a very controversial move in many ways, especially in the election period, wouldn't you say?
I think for the first time, aid has become something that's a lot more controversial. That's correct. Definitely in ahead of this 2024 election, the concept of conditioning aid was something that President Biden, before he was entered office, campaigned on not accepting. He said that there would be no conditions on aid. And in going into this election, we didn't really have that same dynamic, but we had in the backdrop this decision from Biden in the spring to withhold a weapons shipment, this 2,000-pound bomb package that got a lot of, I think, attention. During the war, there was this concern from the Biden administration that this would be used in the Rafa operation that the Biden administration was trying to tailor, and the feeling that we don't want it being dropped on an area with so many civilians, and therefore we're going to withhold this one shipment. This turned into this concept of whether or not there was a weapons embargo against Israel, which I think, speaking to Biden administration officials, they say there's a lot of frustration there because this was just one single package that was delayed. And you had, to be honest, my understanding, similar size weapons that actually continued, that this became somewhat even more symbolic. I think it was a way for Biden to say to his more progressive base, look, I did this one thing where I did that nobody's ever done before. I have withheld a weapons shipment. But actually to the more conservative or pro-Israel voters, you can say, look, the weapons kept moving. Yes, there was maybe not the fast tracking that, and this was, I think, the major debate when Netanyahu called an embargo. There was, and he blamed Biden pretty publicly about this several times. What the Biden administration said that was, we just stopped fast tracking weapons. It was something that we don't even necessarily even do for the Ukrainians. And that relationship, I would say, is much warmer. We weren't fast tracking the weapons in a way that we were for Israel towards the beginning of the war. And as the war dragged on, the decision was we're just going to return to the normal bureaucratic processes, which take a little bit longer. But it wasn't like these are weapons that are supposed to be entering Israel the next day. These are packages that take a long time to actually transfer and actually go into use. And the feeling was that this isn't actually contributing or harming Israel's ability to fight Hamas or to combat Iran and its proxies.
It's really fascinating. And everything you're saying is really hearkening back to what you said about this special relationship. Because any other country, I think, would be so grateful to get any of these weapons packages that Israel just basically expects to be getting as a matter of course by this point. But there was a little more micromanaging during this war than we've seen perhaps in other wars, and especially, as you mentioned already, the Rafa Operation. So refresh our memories a little bit about this.
So this was something that Prime Minister Netanyahu said was a key facet of the war, that it's in order to dismantle the last, I think at that time he was talking about the last 2 battalions of Hamas that had yet to be dismantled were in Rafah. And once you dismantle these 2 battalions, the war will be over. I think that ended up happening maybe a little bit less after it didn't happen immediately, I would say, after Netanyahu said it would. But basically, this was something that Netanyahu really felt that Israel had to do. The concern, though, is that the IDF had been slowly pushing Palestinians lower and lower into Gaza to the point where most of them, over 1 million of them, nearly 1.5 million, were in Rafah. And that made this operation to try to dismantle these last 2 battalions much more difficult. So I think that there was initially a Biden red line that was put against this operation. It's not how the Biden administration will say it publicly, but my understanding is that there was a red line, but that red line was quickly made pink and then slowly shifted to, we're not telling you not to go into Rafah, but we're just telling you that you need to do it in a way that accounts for the civilians there. And therefore, what Israel ended up doing after taking Biden's, his aide's advice into account, was pushing those Palestinians into the Mawasi coastal humanitarian zone and then moving into Rafah and managing to carry out the operation. They still very much flattened most of Rafah, but the relative amount of civilian casualties compared to how it looked in Khan Yunis was different than in Rafah, and you saw a slightly smaller amount. I think the feeling amongst Israel is, there was a lot of micromanaging, but at the same time, what Biden said ahead of this, when he made this public somewhat red line about Rafah, was that you can't have another 30,000 Palestinians dead. And I think at that time, there was a feeling that Israel was carrying out strikes with a little bit less discriminatory practices and carrying out strikes, according to Biden administration officials, to maybe take out 1 or 2 commanders that had the impact of also taking out mass amounts of civilians. They felt that was happening too often. And therefore that they wanted to, we're going to continue supporting this war, but we do want to take more drastic steps, I guess you could say, to limit civilian casualties. I think that was definitely, given the massive blowback that Biden was feeling back home for supporting the war at all. So I think this was maybe the middle ground. Yes, it was micromanaging. They recognized that, I think, but this was the best they could do to at least allow Israel to continue fighting. And I think that was obviously a conversation that was not comfortable for the Israelis and Americans to have, but it did allow the war to continue for, obviously, nearly 7 more months.
Yeah, until today, obviously, because as we know, as we're recording, the hostage deal has not yet been fully sewn up. Let's talk about the hostages, and then I definitely want to get to Iran, so let's leave some time for that too. But first of all, let's talk about the hostages and your statement earlier in the episode when you talked about the one arm around Israel. I think most of the hostage families really felt 2 Biden arms in a warm embrace, something that perhaps they didn't even feel from their own government. And it really appeared to me that it wasn't only for the U.S. citizen hostage families, but it was just a general blanket, really empathetic, warm embrace of all the suffering that these families are going through. And is that how it played in U.S. media as well?
I think that was one of the few parts of the coverage that you did see a lot of sympathy for the Israeli narrative. There was a lot in the mainstream press, I think, about the story of the hostages. I think maybe not as much as maybe some of these families wanted, but I do think it did get a lot of play, particularly the story of Hersh Goldberg Poland, both before and after his execution. But I think there was this remarkable photo that was taken with the American hostage families and Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Biden when they were all at the White House last year, where you had the American hostage families sitting on one side of the table with President Biden, and on the opposite side was Prime Minister Netanyahu. And there was this bizarre scenario where it almost, I think the picture showed this idea that Biden was the one working for the release of the hostages, and Netanyahu, he was trying to negotiate with Netanyahu in order to secure the release, which is just like a remarkable image to have to think about, given that Prime Minister Netanyahu, these are also Israeli citizens that are being held. But that, I think, was the feeling amongst the hostage family specifically, who felt that Biden was, yes, as you mentioned, more the shoulder they could lean on. He reached out to them before Netanyahu did. Well before Netanyahu did. I think In the aftermath, as Netanyahu, I think maybe was trying to not be seen as part of the problem of, or the failure of October 7th were the hostage families. And I think he tried to distance himself initially from them, whereas Biden immediately embraced them and tried to bring about their release. But I think he struggled in actually going about doing it. And maybe it was part of this arm around Israel approach that I think, again, the administration tried to use at the beginning of the war, like they did in May 2021. But the difference is massive. The differences in the scenario are just not the same, that you have this government now that has these far-right elements that were not going to allow Bibi to make a lot of the concessions necessary to secure a hostage deal, and that really slowed the negotiations. You had Ben-Gvir just a couple of days ago talk about how he managed to thwart deals over the past year. And in addition to the fact that this is just a different government that Biden administration is working with, you also have a very different scenario. The May 2021 war is not the same as October 7th. The trauma that Israelis were facing after the Hamas onslaught is something that totally colored a lot of their decision making, and it was why I think you saw right after October 7th this talk of not one drop of water, no aid going into Gaza. That was, I think, that a lot of Israelis understandably were speaking from a place of trauma, and I think that Biden did manage at that point to get aid to start flowing into Gaza through Egypt after he had that visit. I think that was a condition of his visit, we have learned. But beyond that, other steps, mainly ending the war and getting through the hostage negotiation process, was much, much more difficult given these new circumstances and it took, I think, the Biden administration a lot longer to realize that this approach of arm around Israel wouldn't work. And it took basically until around April or May when you saw this decision to withhold that one weapon shipment, that there was going to have to be a bit more carrots, a bit more sticks in addition to the carrots, was the way that the Biden administration felt. Now, Israel obviously sees things differently and felt that there was the micromanaging started from the beginning.
In the end of May, Biden made a very famous declarative speech, essentially, that the hostage release deal was imminent. Here we are again in January. Last night, as we mentioned, there was another declarative speech that the deal has been made. And as we're recording on Thursday evening, Israel time, this deal has not been made. And I just wonder, in a way, why Biden signed on to have the second declarative speech after being so burned in May. What do you think, Jacob?
So I don't think he was burned in May. I think the May speech was, I think, actually a pretty smart political move, that a few days earlier, Prime Minister Netanyahu had signed off on this phased hostage deal that the Biden administration had been putting together, and basically put together Israel's own proposal based on that staged approach, and said we're willing to sign up to it, and willing to sign up to basically the deal that he now has his negotiation team agreed to take on Wednesday. And the feeling amongst the Biden administration was that Netanyahu says things privately that he doesn't actually, once it comes to the money time, he's not actually willing to hold by them. So what we're going to do is publicly announce the parameters of the deal that Israel signed on to, say that Israel signed on to them, and then try to call on to Hamas to get the other half of the side and get an agreement. And I think it did put Netanyahu in a difficult position at the time. And there was a feeling that there was momentum at that point to get a deal. Obviously, that didn't happen. And we saw Hamas drag its feet for a while. It did actually submit a response in the beginning of July that was largely an acceptance of that Israeli proposal that Biden had laid out. And then we had basically a month of Netanyahu dragging his feet before eventually issuing these 4 new conditions regarding Israel's withdrawal from Gaza, particularly, that really torpedoed negotiations, according to Arab diplomats and even one Israeli member of Israel's negotiating team that said that really set back negotiations. And the feeling was, yes, maybe Biden had abandoned this arm around Israel approach, but wasn't really able to influence Netanyahu enough to say yes to the deal at that point. That doesn't mean that Hamas would have then after that turned around and maybe added new conditions of its own. But there was the feeling that the U.S. needed to bring Netanyahu across the finish line, and it wasn't able to do so, despite, I think, Biden's best efforts and I think maybe best intentions. And it took President Trump and his election to maybe change the dynamic. And I think where you have before with Biden, you had a president in that Netanyahu had no problem publicly disparaging. With Trump, I don't think Netanyahu would ever even consider. I think he, in a lot of ways, fears what he could do upon entering office if Netanyahu doesn't fall in line. And that, I think, was enough to, with what you had this meeting with Steve Witkoff over the previous weekend, that really changed the dynamic in the negotiations, led to this breakthrough that we saw a deal announced or reached a couple days later and then announced a couple days after that. That the Arab mediators I spoke with said that they credited this kind of pressure that the out of all people was coming from Trump and not Biden, that we hadn't had this level of pressure on Netanyahu, the actual tangible pressure that yields results. We hadn't seen that all year, and that was really lacking. And they credit Trump and his Steve and Witkoff for having carried that out. Now, you asked about whether or not Biden and all these, it wasn't just Biden, it was Trump, it was the Prime Minister of Qatar, and obviously Egypt, the other media. They all made this announcement that that there was this deal. I think because given the nature, speaking with one member of the Israeli negotiating team, that there's going to be, of course, even after you announce, there is an expectation that you'll have these kinds of statements from Prime Minister Netanyahu, statements from Hamas saying that there's a breakdown in talks, that we're going to walk away. I think they feel like that's part of the process, and that at the end of the day, Netanyahu, they recognize, has his coalition considerations, and they're likely going to come to the fore towards the end of this first phase of the deal. That when you have to decide whether or not you're going to return to fighting, which Netanyahu has pledged to do, which his coalition partners have said they'll collapse his government if he doesn't do. But let's get this first phase moving forward. And if we don't announce it, it doesn't put the sides in a corner to actually agree to the terms. I think Netanyahu at this point, after Trump himself has said that this is a done deal, this epic deal that he helped create, I have a very hard time seeing him, maybe I'll eat my words, but walking back on these commitments at this point.
Right, we just don't know. So let's turn our gaze to Iran for a few minutes before we say goodbye. And the whole issue of Iran is so fraught between Biden and Netanyahu. Just very quickly break down why.
Well, I think the Biden administration entered office very much preferring a diplomatic approach to dealing with Iran, and didn't really want to use that threat of military force that Netanyahu has always called on American leaders to use. That shifted a little bit through Biden's time in office. So he entered saying he was going to revive the 2015 nuclear deal that Trump left in 2018, that he was going to not only revive the deal, but make it longer and stronger. That was the campaign pitch that he used to, I think, win over some of Biden's more pro-Israel supporters who are concerned about the democratic approach to Iran. And then when he entered office, he realized that it was going to be a lot harder to put the toothpaste back in the tube. Once that Trump left the deal, going back to it was the amount of political capital that Obama used in 2015 to make the deal was astronomical. And I think the prioritization of Biden was on other issues. It was on, or as a lot of presidents come into office saying they're going to pivot to China. I think that was definitely the approach as well. And you had less focus of trying to actualize that promise of getting a longer and stronger deal. And basically the decision was to just somewhat ease sanctions in some areas, expand them in others, and just kind of manage the problem. And that clearly blew up on October 7th with Hamas's attack. There are a lot of Biden himself said it was pushed by Iran and the Palestinian, or it was pushed by Iran and Hamas in order to thwart his effort to try to get a Saudi normalization deal. But I think afterwards, in the aftermath of the past few months and the massive weakening of Iran and its proxies, the Biden administration says actually our efforts helped bring Iran to its weakest state in decades. They're talking about the weakest state since the 1979 revolution. They point to the fact that the U.S. helped Israel in thwarting 2 Iranian missile attacks. And also, Biden likes to say that he kind of focus Netanyahu's response to those attacks in a way that was productive, that you dismantled Iran's air defenses, and have obviously weakened its proxies by supporting the Israeli efforts against Hezbollah. And then you had the fall of Assad, and basically Iran is in a much weaker place. That's how the Biden administration is definitely pitching it going into the next administration. I think Netanyahu has wanted to maybe, or talked about, I don't know if he's actually proven to act on it, is to put that final nail in the coffin of maybe some sort of strike against Iran's nuclear program. And that's where something I think that Biden continued to, I think, the end of his term, really shy away from. And it'll be something that Trump will have to decide. But he's entering office too, saying that he would rather prefer a diplomatic approach. So I think there's more to come on this issue in terms of whether or not you'll really actually see eye to eye between Israel and the U.S., just because Netanyahu and Trump are more equally hawkish, and Netanyahu and Trump was able to take steps that Biden wasn't, like the killing of Qasem Soleimani. I think Trump is now entering office very much making more clear that he wants a deal, which I'm not sure Israel is too thrilled about.
So if we were to break down the Biden term in just 3 points vis-a-vis Israel, how would you see it?
I think you can say, again, well-intentioned, and clearly, as we talked about, a Zionist, and who wants to ensure that Israel can remain both a Jewish state and a democratic one. And that's how I think the things played out in terms of his pushback, or his subtle pushback regarding the judicial overhaul. But in terms of results, I think they were limited. And I think he was dealt a very, very difficult hand, given what happened on October 7th, given the government that he was having to work with in Israel. I think that widely understood as the most right-wing in Israel's history. And that really, I think, limited a lot of the steps that he said he was going to be trying to do. I think there was talk of he didn't try to do this massive peace plan entering office, and he was the first person to try to really deprioritize the conflict to begin with. He talked about, or his aides talked about, just maybe incremental steps to try and maybe not manage the conflict, but create the conditions for an eventual two-state solution, recognizing that the parties aren't ready for that right now. But let's not try to go for it all for the Hail Mary, because if we fail again, that really will bring the parties further back. So they just tried to maybe restart a relationship with the Palestinian Authority, which got bad quite quickly because they didn't fulfill some of these promises that they made during the campaign to reopen diplomatic offices that were closed by Trump. But reopen the Palestinian relationship, small steps to try to get a better situation on the ground in the West Bank. Didn't really succeed there. We saw massive amounts of settlement growth given the kind of government and obviously that was in Israel, and obviously the settler violence that peaked over the past year. And I think the epitome of this real struggle to succeed was where you had Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, shortly before October 7th, published this article in Foreign Affairs that talked about the Middle East being the quietest it had been in years because of the administration's policies in the Middle East. And I think that was proven very much not to be true just a few days after. And I don't think you can blame the administration and say it's because they just tried to do these incremental steps and didn't try to go for it all or really push Israel harder towards two states. But clearly, this decision to deprioritize didn't help the situation. And then once things got really bad, he had a really hard time actually influencing Netanyahu at a more strategic level. Yes, the more tactical wins were guiding the response to Iran's missile attack, guiding Israel on U.S. humanitarian aid into Gaza, and of course the Rafa Operation. But in order to actually go about ending the war, Biden needed Trump to kind of seal the deal on that for him. And I think that shows the limits to his influence of someone who I think was very well intentioned.
Jacob, thank you so much for joining me for the Friday Focus this week.
Thanks for having me, Amanda. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Thanks for listening and watching, perhaps, the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Please check out another episode tomorrow. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, Shalom.